Taxes, taxes, will you always haunt me? Will I always have to work in vain? You have caused me many tribulations. Taxes, taxes, you have taxed my brain.
Read my lips.
Morning, Phil. It's been a little while since we had last met, but we're going to embark on another one of our podcasts. Now, let me note to our listeners that Phil has an economics degree and an MBA and a keen interest in many current affairs. And today we're going to take a look at the issue of the Laffer curve, or more specifically, the notion that tax cuts, or at least reductions in income tax rates, will actually lead to a greater degree of government revenues than less. So with that, Phil, let me turn it over to you. What do you think about this issue?
Good morning, Pete. So I've been trying to anticipate which issues in the upcoming election will be ripe for us to take a look at. You know, the types of issues where you get lots of surface level political pitches, issues that need a little deeper look, issues that just need some common sense sprinkled on them. I've been looking into the concept that tax cuts can stimulate the economy to the point where they actually raise government revenue. This idea has been around a long time, but it got popularized by celebrity economist Arthur Laffer in the late 70s, and it's been a topic in every presidential campaign since, especially leading up to the significant tax reforms of 1981, 86, 92, and 2017.
Now, let me think about this. As I recall, the Laffer curve became a hot issue about the time that you were an MBA student. Is that correct?
That's true. In the midst of having a good time at Chico State, and of course you were at UC at the same time, UC Santa Cruz. In the midst of all that, one of the things we did was study the Laffer curve and his work. The Laffer curve has become the traditional way to show that relationship between tax rates and tax revenue. It shows that at zero tax rate, you will get zero tax revenue. Also, if you tax 100%, you can expect very little economic activity. At least nobody will report income, so you'll also get zero tax revenue. The high point in the curve is where you'll get the maximum tax revenue. This logic is sound, but there's controversy over where we actually are on the curve. Are we to the left of the peak, where increasing tax rates increases government revenue, or are we to the right of the peak? Are we already at a high enough tax rates where cutting tax rates will actually increase tax revenue? You'll hear the sound bites from the politicians, and they'll try to bolster their case by getting an economist to back what they're saying. I wanted to take a look at what the studies say and what the majority of the economists believe.
Well, Phil, thinking back to my days as an undergraduate in economics, as well as when I was a doctoral student at University of Texas, Austin, we talked a lot about tax rates, but rarely was the generation of tax revenue the primary consideration. Usually there were other objectives with respect to tax policy. So can you comment on that?
Oh, yeah. Tax cuts get proposed for economic stimulus and job creation. Depending on the details of the plan, they also have an impact on income distribution. When the actual proposals come out this year, we'll have a podcast to sprinkle some common sense on them by looking at the backup studies. The major downside to tax cuts is the effect on government revenue and national debt. If you believe that a tax cut actually increases government revenue, there's not much need to study how much growth it will generate. If a politician can sell a tax cut as an actual revenue generator, this frees them from answering questions about the trade-offs between stimulating the economy and increasing the national debt.
A bit like, taking your cake and eating it too.
Yeah.
I would say that that's a nice notion, but what really is the consensus amongst economists? Where do we stand in our understanding of this issue?
It's very easy to use Google, and you'll find overwhelming rejection by economists of the idea that tax cuts will result in higher tax revenues. This includes studies from organizations with center-right or center reputations, such as the Tax Foundation and NBER. This also includes the academic studies that you sent me, Professor Pete. Intuitively, it stretches the imagination that you could lower the rate but collect more money. It depends on the sensitivity of the tax revenue to a change in the tax rate. Output would have to increase substantially to offset the lower tax rate in order to generate more revenue. This is a dubious proposition, especially when there are already high levels of employment. The Kent Clark Center, that is not superhero Clark Kent, the Kent Clark Center from the University of Chicago surveyed 40 economists in 2012. They found mixed results on whether a tax cut would raise GDP, but 0% agreed that it would actually raise tax revenue. 71% where they disagree, strongly disagree. The rest were uncertain, no opinion, but 0% agreed that it would actually raise tax revenue. It was harder to find economists that believe a tax decrease raises revenue. So let's go to Laffer's work to try and find it. Laffer seems to cherry pick his way through the data, taking any positive data and assigning the cause as a previous tax cut. I reviewed an article he published in 2015 where he contends that the Reagan-era tax cuts did indeed pay for themselves. He ignores the fact that seeing increased deficit happening due to the tax cuts, there were a series of tax increases implemented starting in 1982. Central to his theories is the concept that individuals will work more and corporations will invest more if they anticipate a lower tax rate. To make some numbers work, he contends that the Reagan era starts in 1983 because that's when the full tax cuts were implemented. When he does a before and after analysis, he includes 1982 as a before tax cut data point. Seems like a convenient cutoff. The 1981 tax cuts had already started and all the other tax cuts were laid out. Any incentives to work and invest were clearly known by late 1981. Laffer does make a good case for capital gains rate cuts resulting in increased revenue in the short term. It's reasonable that taxpayers can time their capital gains to the tax rate changes. This effect is not due to economic growth and has nothing to do with the Laffer curve. In the longer term, since taxpayers can time their reporting, it should lower the total revenue. When combined with regular income tax, it also skews the numbers to look like tax cuts are doing more to increase revenue. He states that the income tax revenues from the top 1% of income earners increased from 1.5% to 2% of GDP from 1981 to 89, while their top income tax rate went from 70% down to 28%. Some of this comes from capital gains reporting. The rest comes from income inequality increase. Since this is all calculated as a percent of GDP, it doesn't show increased revenue, just the rich getting richer.
Okay, then. So does this lead you to believe that the Reagan tax cuts were ill-advised and perhaps even some subsequent cuts in the Bush and Trump administrations?
The Economic Recovery Tax Act of 1981 had some benefits for sure. Indexing the brackets to inflation is a good idea. The 70% tax bracket seems too high. Lower taxes stimulated the economy when unemployment was high. I believe these measures helped. I'm just not willing to tell myself that it's for free. The problem is that Republican politicians have pushed the idea that the United States tax rates were to the right of the peak of the curve, that tax cuts raise government revenue. This reasoning was behind the Republican tax cuts in the Reagan, Bush, and Trump administrations.
Okay, then. So let's wrap it up. What's the bottom line?
I agree with economist John Quiggin, who distinguishes between the Laffer curve and Laffer's analysis of tax rates. Quiggin said that the Laffer curve was correct, but unoriginal. Laffer's analysis that the United States was to the right of the peak of the Laffer curve was original, but incorrect. In recessionary times, it is expected to have an increased deficit because of lower tax revenues and recovery spending. The budget policies used by Democratic presidents have allowed the annual deficit to decrease as the economy improves. Every Republican since Reagan has left office with a budget deficit higher than the one he inherited. Clinton and Obama, by contrast, left office with smaller deficits. The 2020 recession debt at the end of the Trump administration skews the data, but the Trump budgets had already established a pattern of higher spending and less revenue. The numbers actually show Biden decreasing the annual deficit, but these numbers are also skewed coming off of all the pandemic spending. It appears like Biden is making some progress on the annual budget, but history is still to tell. This is not the whole story on the annual deficit or the total national debt. I believe that both parties, especially the Democrats, spend too much. I would just like to establish that when you hear politicians promising you that they can reduce your tax rate while increasing government revenue, giving you a freebie, remember, most economists disagree.
Hey, great, Phil. Really appreciate your insights here, and I hope that our listeners have gained some insights. Thanks.
Will you always haunt me? Will I always have to work in vain? You have caused me many tribulations. Taxes, taxes, you have taxed my brain.